The Krillian Dominion had never lost a war. For over 600 years, it had grown across the stars like a slow, patient fire, swallowing world after world. Some species surrendered the moment a Krillian fleet entered their system. Others tried to fight, but their fights never lasted long. The Dominion's ships were bigger, their weapons were sharper, and their soldiers did not feel fear the way most living things did. They had been bred and trained for one purpose only: conquest. The Dominion did not conquer for hatred. They conquered because it was simply what they did. Every species they found was studied for a short time, given one chance to surrender, and then either absorbed into the Empire as workers, or destroyed if they resisted too much. It was a system that had worked for 6 centuries without a single failure. The Dominion's generals had stopped expecting real resistance a long time ago. War, to them, had become routine, a formality, a box to check before a new planet was added to the Empire's long list of conquests. That was why, when Krillian scouts found a small blue planet on the edge of a quiet spiral arm, nobody in the High Command felt any excitement. It was just another planet. Their scanners picked up signs of a technological species: radio signals, satellites, primitive fusion reactors, and strange chaotic patterns of energy use that suggested a species still deep in its early stages of growth. The scouts labeled the planet designation Sol 3, filed their report, and moved on to their next task. It would be handled the way every other planet had been handled. A fleet would be sent, a message would be delivered. The natives would either kneel or be removed. Admiral Threxil Vaughn was given the assignment. He was not one of the Dominion's most celebrated commanders, but he was reliable, and reliable was exactly what a routine invasion needed. He had led 14 previous formality campaigns, as they were called inside the fleet, missions where the outcome was already decided before the first shot was fired. He expected this one to be the 15th. He did not even bring his full battle fleet. He brought 12 cruisers, 3 troop carriers, and 1 flagship, a force that had been more than enough to bring far more advanced species to their knees. When the Krillian fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, alarms went off across Earth almost immediately. Deep space telescopes, military satellites, and amateur astronomers all caught the sudden burst of unusual gravitational distortion near Jupiter. Within hours, every major government on Earth knew that something enormous and clearly artificial had just appeared in their solar system. There was panic, of course. There always is. In the first hours after something like that happens, news channels broke into normal programming. Stock markets shook. People filled the streets in some cities, glued to their phones in others. But there was something else too, something the Krillian Dominion had never encountered in any of its previous conquests. Instead of falling into helpless fear, the governments of Earth began to talk to each other. Old rivalries were put aside, at least for the moment. Emergency councils were formed. Military leaders from dozens of nations began sharing information in ways they never had before. The Dominion, of course, knew none of this. Admiral Vaughn's ships continued their slow approach toward the third planet, following the same procedure that had worked so many times before. A single message was prepared, translated by the fleet's automatic linguistic systems after they intercepted and studied Earth's radio and television broadcasts for a short time. The message was simple. It always was. It told the people of Sol 3 that the Krillian Dominion had claimed their planet as a new territory, that resistance was pointless, and that surrender within 48 hours would guarantee the survival and eventual usefulness of their species within the Empire. It was broadcast on every frequency the Dominion could find, cutting into television signals, radio stations, and even military channels. Billions of people around the world heard, in their own language, translated by an alien machine, a calm and almost bored voice, telling them that their planet now belonged to someone else. For a moment, the whole world seemed to freeze. Then, slowly, it did not. In an underground command bunker outside Colorado Springs, a joint military committee watched the message play on a dozen screens. General Elena Cho, who had spent the last 6 hours coordinating with counterparts in Beijing, Moscow, London, and New Delhi, listened to the translated ultimatum without saying a word. When it finished, the room was silent for almost a full minute. "They didn't ask," she finally said. "They told us. Every species they've conquered has surrendered," said one of the analysts, a young man who had been reading intelligence summaries pulled together from decades of half-serious SETI research and speculative defense planning. If the patterns in their broadcast language are anything to go by, they're not expecting a fight. They're expecting paperwork. General Cho looked at the screen, at the 12 alien ships glowing faintly against the dark of space, caught on a long-range telescope feed. She thought about the 48-hour deadline. She thought about every war Earth had ever fought against itself. Wars that had produced weapons, tactics, and a kind of stubborn defiance that no outside power had ever had to deal with before. Then let's give them something new, she said. Word moved fast after that. Within 12 hours, the United Nations Security Council held an emergency session, something that had never happened with such total unity before. For once, the great rivalries of Earth did not matter. Nations that had spent decades distrusting each other agreed, almost without argument, on one single point: humanity would not surrender. It was not that Earth's governments believed they could win. Nobody was foolish enough to think that a handful of nuclear-armed nations could defeat a species capable of interstellar travel. But there was something deeper at play, something the Dominion's translators had never picked up on. Humanity had spent its entire history fighting, against nature, against disease, against each other, against impossible odds. Surrender was not a natural response for a species like this. It was, if anything, the least likely response of all. Admiral Vaughn received Earth's official reply exactly 48 hours after his ultimatum was sent. It was short, it was blunt, and it made him pause for the first time in 14 campaigns. We refuse. Just 2 words, spoken by a human representative on a broadcast recorded specifically for the Dominion fleet, using their own translated language patterns sent back through the same channel. No pleading, no terms, no attempt at negotiation, just refusal. Vaughn reviewed the message twice, then a third time, checking for translation errors. There were none. He called his senior officers together in the flagship's command chamber, a wide circular room lit by soft blue light, its walls covered in slowly shifting star charts. They refuse, he told them. There was a long silence. None of the officers gathered there had ever heard those words used in response to a Dominion ultimatum. Refusal happened sometimes, technically, but it was rare, and it always came from species who had some obvious military advantage, some fleet or defense grid capable of at least putting up a real fight. Earth had none of that. Their technology, according to every scan the Dominion had taken, was primitive. Chemical rockets, basic nuclear weapons, no shields, no functioning warp drive. By every measurement the Dominion used to judge a species' threat level, Earth should have surrendered within the hour. They have no fleet, said one officer. No orbital defense. Nothing that should give them the confidence to refuse. Perhaps they don't understand what refusal means, suggested another. Vaughn considered this. It was possible. Species sometimes misunderstood the seriousness of a Dominion ultimatum, especially in their first contact with a truly advanced power. He decided to give them one more chance, a courtesy rarely extended, but one that cost nothing and might avoid unnecessary bloodshed. He ordered a smaller force, 3 cruisers, and a single troop carrier, to descend toward the planet's surface and make contact directly, landing near one of the larger population centers, to deliver the message again, in person, with the full weight of Dominion presence behind it. He chose to land near a city called Geneva, a location Dominion linguistic analysis had flagged as a center for diplomacy and negotiation among the humans. It seemed a fitting choice. If the humans wanted to talk, they could talk there, under the shadow of Dominion warships. What Admiral Vaughn did not know, what none of the Dominion's scans, translators, or 6 centuries of conquest experience could have told him, was that the moment his ultimatum had been broadcast across Earth's airwaves, something had changed. Humanity's militaries were not sitting still, waiting to be conquered. They were working. Scientists who had spent their careers dreaming about extraterrestrial contact were suddenly given unlimited funding and impossible deadlines. Military engineers who understood decades of theoretical alien defense scenarios, dreamed up in classified think tanks and war games nobody outside a few locked rooms had ever taken seriously, were pulled out of retirement and put to work immediately. Humanity did not have starships. It did not have shields or plasma weapons or anything close to what the Dominion possessed. But it had something the Dominion had never faced in 600 years of conquest. A species that had spent its entire existence learning how to fight against enemies stronger than itself, and had never once given up because of it. As the three Dominion cruisers began their descent toward Geneva, carrying Admiral Vaughan's second and final ultimatum, nobody on those ships noticed the quiet movement of anti-aircraft batteries repositioning across the Swiss countryside. Nobody noticed the sudden, coordinated silence that fell across global air traffic control, or the careful positioning of experimental electromagnetic pulse devices that half a dozen nations had rushed to complete in the last 48 hours, working together in a way that would have seemed impossible just 1 week earlier. The Dominion had come expecting a formality. Instead, without knowing it yet, they had just made their first mistake in 600 years of unbroken conquest, a mistake that would soon prove to be the beginning of the end for everything they thought they understood about war, about strength, and about the strange, stubborn little planet they had chosen to underestimate. The cruisers continued their descent, calm and confident, exactly as they always had been. They would not stay calm for much longer. The three Dominion cruisers entered Earth's atmosphere without any resistance, gliding down through the clouds above Switzerland with the same calm confidence Admiral Vaughan's fleet had shown in 600 years of conquest. Their sensors detected nothing unusual. Civilian air traffic had cleared the area, which the Dominion officers assumed was simple fear, a natural response from a species about to meet its new rulers. They did not know it was actually a carefully coordinated military decision, made jointly by generals who, only a week earlier, would never have agreed to share a phone call, let alone a battle plan. The cruisers landed in a wide field just outside Geneva, their massive hulls settling onto the grass with barely a sound. Hatches opened. Krillian soldiers marched out in orderly rows, armored in dark plating, carrying weapons that could vaporize a human body in less than a second. Behind them came a diplomatic envoy, a smaller, more slender Krillian named Alice Dairn, whose job was to deliver the final terms of surrender in person, exactly as the Dominion had done on hundreds of other worlds. A group of human representatives waited to meet them, standing near a row of black vehicles at the edge of the landing field. General Elena Cho stood among them, along with diplomats from several nations and a small team of translators. To the Krillian soldiers watching through their armor's sensors, the humans looked exactly as expected: small, physically weak, clearly frightened. Several Dominion officers later admitted they had almost felt sorry for them. Envoy Dairn approached the human delegation, moving with the practiced calm of someone who had done this many times before, on many other worlds. "You have refused the Dominion's offer," Dairn said, the words translated instantly by a small device hovering near her shoulder. "This is your final opportunity. Submit now, and your species will be preserved as a productive part of the Empire. Refuse again, and the consequences will not be gentle." General Cho did not flinch. "We already gave you our answer," she said. Dairn tilted her head slightly, an expression that might have been confusion, or perhaps mild irritation. "Then you understand what will happen next." "We understand," Cho replied, "but we're not the only ones who prepared an answer." It was at that exact moment that the trap, quietly built over the previous 48 hours by a joint task force, representing more than a dozen nations, was triggered. High above the landing site, an experimental electromagnetic device, built in a rushed collaboration between American, Japanese, and German engineers, based on decades of half-forgotten theoretical research into disabling advanced electronics, detonated with a silent, invisible pulse. It had been designed specifically after studying the frequencies and energy signatures the Dominion ships gave off during their approach, patterns quickly analyzed by teams of physicists working non-stop since the ultimatum was first broadcast. The pulse tore through the electronics of the three landed cruisers, overloading their shields and disabling half of their internal systems in an instant. At the same time, hidden anti-aircraft batteries, repositioned over the last 2 days under the cover of civilian construction equipment, opened fire on the Dominion soldiers still standing in formation outside their ships. It was not enough firepower to destroy the invaders completely. Nothing on Earth was capable of that yet, but it was more than enough to catch them completely by surprise. For the first time in 600 years, Dominion soldiers found themselves under sustained, coordinated attack from a species they had assumed was already defeated. Envoy Dairn barely had time to register what was happening before Krillian soldiers around her began falling, their advanced armor unable to stop everything Earth scientists had rushed to build in less than 2 days. The soldiers, trained to fight species that either surrendered immediately or fought in disorganized, primitive ways, found themselves facing coordinated fire from multiple directions, weapons specifically designed, using data gathered from studying their own ships during the descent. The battle at Geneva lasted less than 20 minutes, but it changed everything. By the end of it, one of the 3 Dominion cruisers had been destroyed completely. Its disabled shields, unable to protect it from a coordinated missile strike, launched the moment its systems went offline. The other 2 managed to lift off and retreat back into orbit, badly damaged, carrying wounded soldiers and an envoy who had never once in her career needed to run for her life. Admiral Vaughn received the reports aboard his flagship with a growing sense of disbelief. Losses. Real losses. A destroyed cruiser. Dozens of soldiers killed or wounded. An envoy forced to retreat under fire. In 600 years, the Dominion fleet record had documented very few incidents like this, and none of them had come from a species with technology as primitive as Earth's appeared to be. "Show me the battle data again," Vaughn ordered. His officers replayed it for him. He watched as human weapons, crude by Dominion standards but built with startling speed and precision, tore through Krillian shielding that had never failed like this before. He watched as ground troops, supposedly the most disciplined and effective soldiers in the known galaxy, scattered under fire from an enemy that should not have had the technology to fight back at all, let alone fight back this effectively. "This is not possible," said one of his officers. "Their technology level does not match this kind of response." "Clearly," Vaughn said slowly, "our assessment of their technology level was wrong. What the Dominion did not yet understand, what none of their 6 centuries of conquest had prepared them to understand, was that Earth's strength had never really been about the individual pieces of hardware they built. Human history was a long, brutal story of constant conflict, of nations racing each other to build better weapons, faster ships, smarter strategies, driven by the simple, painful fact that failing to keep up often meant being conquered by a neighbor. That instinct, buried deep in humanity's collective experience, had been switched on the moment the Dominion's ultimatum was broadcast across the planet. And once switched on, it did not turn off easily. Within days of the Geneva battle, humanity's response accelerated in ways the Dominion could not have predicted. Every major spacefaring nation pooled its resources. Private companies that had spent years developing rockets for orbital tourism and satellite launches suddenly found their factories converted into emergency defense production lines. Physicists who had spent their careers studying theoretical particle weapons were given labs and unlimited budgets. Computer scientists who understood advanced cyber warfare were assigned to a new task, studying the electronic signals gathered from the retreating Dominion ships, trying to find any weakness in their systems. It was not a fair fight, not even close. Dominion technology was still centuries ahead of anything Earth could build from scratch. But Earth was not trying to match their technology piece for piece. It was trying to find the cracks, the small weaknesses that could be exploited by a species that had spent its whole existence learning how to punch above its weight. Admiral Vaughn called for reinforcements from Dominion High Command, requesting a larger fleet than the standard force he had originally deployed. It was an unusual request. Formality campaigns almost never required reinforcement. But Vaughn had seen the battle data from Geneva, and he understood, better than most of his superiors back at Dominion Command, that something about this planet did not fit the pattern. While he waited for those reinforcements to arrive, Vaughn ordered a more cautious approach. Rather than another direct assault, he deployed automated surveillance drones to gather more information about Earth's capabilities before committing to another ground engagement. It seemed like the wise choice. In the past, it always had been. But humanity had already learned an important lesson from the Geneva battle, one that would define the rest of the war to come. The Dominion, for all its power, its history, its unbroken record of victory, was not used to being surprised. It had built an empire on the assumption that resistance was rare and always small. It had never needed to develop a real answer to a species that adapted quickly, coordinated globally, and refused, again and again, to accept defeat as inevitable. Within 2 weeks of the ultimatum's first broadcast, Earth's governments had built and deployed a network of ground-based sensors, specifically designed to track Dominion drone activity, using data patterns gathered from the retreating ships at Geneva. When the first wave of Dominion surveillance drones descended to gather intelligence on human military movements, they found themselves flying into carefully prepared jamming fields, Their signals scrambled just enough to send back false or incomplete data to the waiting Dominion fleet above. It was a small victory, almost invisible compared to the destruction of a cruiser, but it mattered more than anyone on Earth realized at the time. It meant that when Admiral Vaughn's reinforcements finally arrived, carrying a fleet nearly 10 times the size of his original force, they would be arriving with an incomplete and partially false picture of what Earth was actually capable of. The Dominion still believed, deep down, that Earth's resistance was a fluke, an unusual stroke of luck that would not repeat itself once real Dominion military strength was brought to bear. Admiral Vaughn was not so sure anymore. He had begun, quietly, to study everything he could about this strange, stubborn species, trying to understand what exactly he was dealing with. He did not yet know that he was looking at the beginning of the end of everything the Dominion had built over 600 years of conquest. But somewhere, deep in his instincts, sharpened by decades of campaigns that had never once gone wrong, a small and uncomfortable doubt had begun to grow. Earth was still standing, and Earth was not done fighting. 3 weeks after the battle at Geneva, the sky above Earth changed. What had once been 12 Dominion ships became more than 100, arriving in a slow, deliberate wave that stretched across the orbital paths of the moon. Admiral Vaughn's reinforcements had arrived, and with them came something Earth had never seen before, the true might of the Krillian Dominion, no longer holding back, no longer treating this as a simple formality. Fleet Commander Ressa Eichhorn arrived with the reinforcements, outranking Vaughn, and taking overall command of what Dominion High Command, now officially classified as a full military campaign, rather than a routine annexation. Eichhorn had a reputation of her own, built across decades of brutal campaigns against species who had dared to resist longer than most. She did not share Vaughn's growing caution. To her, the battle at Geneva was an embarrassment, a stain on Dominion history that needed to be erased quickly and completely. "They caught us unprepared once," she told Vaughn aboard her flagship, the Ashen Verdict, a vessel 3 times the size of anything Vaughn commanded. "That will not happen again." Vaughn, standing quietly beside her, chose his words carefully. "With respect, Commander, I do not think this species fights the way we expect. Every scan, every report, every piece of data we gather about them seems to be outdated within days. They adapt faster than any species I have encountered." Eichhorn dismissed this with a wave of her hand. "All primitive species adapt at first. It means nothing once real force is applied." She was, in a way the Dominion would come to regret, both right and terribly wrong. Real force was about to be applied, but Earth was not simply adapting anymore. It was preparing for exactly this moment, using every day since Geneva to build not just weapons, but alliances, strategies, and a level of coordination that no Dominion campaign had ever needed to account for. What neither Eichhorn nor Vaughn understood yet was that Earth's resistance had already begun attracting attention far beyond its own solar system. The Dominion's empire stretched across hundreds of star systems, and not all of the species living under its rule had joined willingly. Many had been conquered generations ago, their military forces crushed quickly, their populations absorbed into the Dominion's vast labor and resource networks. Among these species were the Halvex, a once proud people known for their skill in engineering, who had been serving the Dominion for over 2 centuries, after a war that had lasted only a few days before their surrender. News of Earth's resistance traveled slowly at first, filtered through Dominion communication networks that were never meant to carry stories of defeat. But information has a way of moving, especially among people who have been waiting a long time for a reason to hope. A maintenance worker aboard a Dominion supply station near Halvex Space overheard fragments of a report about unexpected losses at Sol 3. He mentioned it, quietly, to a friend. That friend mentioned it to another. Within weeks, a rumor had spread through the Halvex worker communities. Somewhere out on the edge of Dominion space, a small, primitive species had fought back against the Empire and survived. It was not much. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was the first spark of something the Dominion had never had to deal with in 600 years of unchallenged rule. Hope, spreading quietly among the very species they had already conquered. Back on Earth, humanity had no idea that its resistance was already being noticed light years away. Its focus remained entirely on the growing Dominion fleet gathering in orbit. Military leaders across the world understood that another Geneva-style ambush would not work twice against a force this size. Eichhorn's fleet was too large, too well defended, too prepared for the kind of surprise that had worked before. So humanity changed its approach. Rather than trying to fight the Dominion fleet directly, Earth's Combined Military Command, now formally organized under a new emergency body called the Global Defense Coalition, focused on two things: buying time and finding weaknesses. The first strategy involved something the Dominion had never considered a real threat: cyber warfare. While Dominion technology was centuries ahead of Earth's in most areas, their systems had never needed to defend against the kind of relentless, creative digital attacks that human hackers, criminal and government alike, had spent decades perfecting against each other. When a small joint team of American, Israeli, and South Korean specialists finally cracked a fragment of the communication protocol used by the damaged cruisers left behind after Geneva, they found something valuable: a way to feed false sensor data directly into Dominion drone networks. It was not a weapon. It could not destroy a single ship, but it meant that when Eichhorn's fleet began deploying reconnaissance drones across the planet, gathering data to plan their next assault, a significant portion of what they gathered was quietly and carefully corrupted, feeding the Dominion an image of Earth's defenses that was both incomplete and, in some places, deliberately misleading. The second strategy was more direct and far riskier. Rather than waiting for the Dominion to choose the time and place of the next battle, a coalition of special forces units from a dozen nations planned a strike of their own, a raid on one of the smaller Dominion vessels that had been left in low orbit, conducting what appeared to be routine atmospheric scans. The operation, codenamed Steel Harvest, involved a modified spaceplane, originally built for high-altitude reconnaissance, fitted with experimental stealth coating, developed in the weeks since Geneva. It carried a small team of soldiers whose mission was not to destroy the Dominion vessel, but to board it, gather technological data, and if possible, extract a working sample of Dominion shielding or weapons technology that Earth's scientists could study. It should not have worked. By every reasonable measure, a mission like this against a species with 600 years of unbroken military dominance should have ended in disaster. But the Dominion, for all its strength, still carried the quiet arrogance of a species that had never truly been challenged. The vessel Steel Harvest targeted was lightly defended, its crew more focused on gathering intelligence than defending against an attack nobody expected a primitive species to attempt. The raid succeeded. It cost lives. 6 soldiers did not make it back, but the mission returned with something priceless: a functioning fragment of Dominion shield technology, along with data drives containing partial fleet schematics. When Fleet Commander Eichhorn learned of the raid, her reaction was very different from Vaughn's growing concern. She was furious, but not afraid. To her, it confirmed exactly what she had always believed: that Earth needed to be crushed quickly, completely, and without further hesitation. "Enough patience," she told her officers. "We move against their largest population center immediately. We show them exactly what happens to a species that dares to steal from the Dominion." Vaughn objected, quietly but firmly. "Commander, every action we take against them seems to make them stronger, not weaker. I recommend caution." "Caution," Eichhorn said, "is what allowed them to destroy one of our ships and board another. I will not repeat that mistake." She ordered a full assault on one of Earth's largest coastal cities, intending to demonstrate the true cost of resistance in a way that could not be ignored. It was, by Dominion standards, a reasonable strategy. It had worked on other worlds. A single overwhelming show of force, aimed at a civilian population, had broken the will of dozens of species before Earth. But those species had not spent their entire history fighting wars against each other. They had not built cities designed, in some cases quite literally, to survive bombardment. They had not developed, over decades of Cold War tension, deep underground shelters, early warning systems, and evacuation protocols originally designed for nuclear conflict between human nations. When Eichhorn's fleet began its bombardment run, they found a city that had already been almost completely evacuated in the hours since Dominion warships had begun repositioning in orbit. Movement Humanity's own tracking systems, sharpened by weeks of desperate improvement, had detected and understood far faster than the Dominion expected. The destruction was still enormous. Buildings fell. Infrastructure was devastated. It was a wound that would take years, perhaps decades, to heal. But it was not the crushing, decisive blow Icorn had wanted. Casualties, while tragic, were a fraction of what the Dominion had expected from an unprepared population. And rather than breaking humanity's will to resist, images and reports of the attack, shared instantly across a planet more connected than any species the Dominion had ever conquered, did the opposite. It united what remained of the doubt. Nations that had still been hesitant, quietly hoping some kind of negotiated settlement might still be possible, abandoned that hope entirely. Public support for resistance, already strong, became absolute. Young men and women who had never considered military service volunteered in numbers that overwhelmed recruitment centers. Scientists worked without sleep. Factories ran around the clock. And far away, aboard a Dominion supply station near Halvex space, the whisper about a primitive species that refused to surrender grew a little louder, carried now not just by rumor, but by fragments of encrypted Dominion battle reports that spoke, with obvious frustration, of a campaign that was not going as planned. The Dominion had wanted to teach Earth a lesson about the cost of resistance. Instead, without meaning to, they had just given the rest of their empire something far more dangerous than a lesson. They had given them an example. 2 months into the war, Earth was a very different planet than the one Admiral Vaughn had first approached with a routine ultimatum. Cities that had once been centers of commerce and tourism were now surrounded by hidden bunkers, mobile defense platforms, and layers of camouflage designed by engineers who had studied every scrap of data recovered from Steel Harvest and the wreckage at Geneva. Factories across dozens of nations ran without stopping, producing weapons based on reverse-engineered fragments of Dominion technology, mixed with old human designs nobody had ever expected to actually use. It was still not enough to match the Dominion ship for ship, weapon for weapon. Fleet Commander Icorn's forces remained overwhelmingly more powerful in raw military terms. But Earth had stopped trying to fight a fair fight a long time ago. It was fighting the only way it knew how, by adapting faster than its enemy could adjust. Icorn, however, was no longer fighting alone against a stubborn planet. She was fighting a growing problem within her own fleet, one she did not yet fully understand. The Dominion's military had been built, over 6 centuries, around a simple assumption: species that resisted eventually broke, and species that were conquered stayed conquered. Soldiers within the Dominion fleet were drawn from dozens of different worlds, many of them conquered generations ago, trained and equipped to fight for an empire they had never chosen, but had long ago accepted as unbeatable. That acceptance had always been the true foundation of Dominion power. Fear was useful, but true control came from something deeper. The belief, held by billions of beings across hundreds of worlds, that resistance was simply pointless. Earth was slowly, unintentionally, destroying that belief. Reports of the human resistance, filtered and censored as they moved through official Dominion channels, still managed to leak into the wider empire, carried by soldiers writing home, by workers gossiping on supply stations, by encrypted fragments traded quietly among species who had learned long ago how to pass information the Dominion did not want shared. The details grew and changed as they spread, as stories always do, but the core of it stayed the same and grew more powerful with every retelling. A small, primitive species had refused Dominion demands, fought back against overwhelming force, and was still standing. Among the Halvex, the whispered rumors from weeks earlier had grown into something much larger. Halvex engineers, forced for generations to build and maintain Dominion warships, began quietly, carefully, introducing tiny flaws into their work. Nothing large enough to be noticed immediately. A slightly weaker weld here, a processing delay there, small imperfections that would, months or years down the line, cause equipment failures the Dominion would never trace back to deliberate sabotage. It was not open rebellion. Not yet. The Halvex, like most conquered species within the Dominion, understood the price of open resistance far too well. But it was something the Dominion had never needed to worry about before. Quiet, deliberate resistance, spreading slowly through the machinery of the Empire itself. Back on Earth, humanity's leadership remained unaware of the ripples their resistance was sending through Dominion space. Their focus stayed entirely on survival, on finding a way to turn the tide of a war that still, by every reasonable measurement, should have been unwinnable. The turning point came not from a single battle, but from a discovery, made deep in a research lab outside Geneva. the same city where the war had truly begun. Using the shield fragment recovered during Steel Harvest, along with data gathered from the destroyed cruiser, and months of relentless research, a joint team of physicists finally understood something crucial about Dominion shield technology. It relied on a narrow, specific frequency range to maintain its strength, a range that had never needed to change in 600 years, because no enemy had ever come close to understanding it, let alone targeting it directly. It was not a weakness by design, it was a weakness born from pure, unchallenged confidence. The Dominion had built its shields to be strong against anything they had ever faced. They had never needed to build them to be unpredictable, because no one had ever forced them to. Earth scientists, working with what little time and resources they had, began developing a new class of weapon, not more powerful than existing human weapons, but tuned specifically to disrupt the exact frequency range Dominion shields depended on. It would not destroy a ship outright, but it would, for a brief window of time, leave that ship's defenses open. The Global Defense Coalition decided to use this discovery not for another small, defensive skirmish, but for something far more ambitious, a coordinated strike against Icorn's flagship itself, the Ashen Verdict, still holding position in high orbit as the anchor of Dominion Command. It was, by any reasonable military standard, an incredibly risky plan. Striking directly at a fleet commander's flagship was the kind of move that either ended a war quickly or ended it in complete disaster. But Earth's leadership, hardened by 2 months of war, had run out of patience for slow, defensive strategies. If they were going to fight the Dominion, they decided, they needed to make them feel real fear, the same way Icorn had tried, and failed, to make Earth feel it. The operation required perfect coordination between newly developed frequency disruption technology, a fleet of modified orbital launch vehicles, repurposed from civilian space programs, and a diversionary assault meant to draw Dominion attention away from the true target until the last possible moment. It began at night, using the rotation of the Earth itself as cover. Diversionary strikes hit several smaller Dominion vessels stationed near the Pacific, drawing exactly the kind of aggressive, overconfident response Icorn was known for. As she redirected attention and resources toward crushing what she believed was humanity's main offensive, the real strike force, carrying the newly developed frequency disruption devices, launched directly toward the Ashen Verdict under cover of the chaos. For the first time since the war began, Dominion sensors failed to notice a coordinated human attack until it was already underway. The frequency disruption devices detonated in a tight formation around the flagship, and for nearly 90 seconds, the Ashen Verdict's shields flickered and failed completely. It was not enough time to destroy the ship. Its hull was simply too strong, too heavily reinforced for anything Earth currently possessed. But it was enough time for a coordinated missile strike, launched from modified human orbital platforms, to tear through unprotected sections of the vessel, crippling several weapon systems, and forcing Icorn's flagship to retreat from orbit entirely for emergency repairs. It was the first time in 600 years that a Dominion fleet commander's flagship had been forced to withdraw from an active campaign. Aboard the Ashen Verdict, in the chaos following the attack, Icorn stood in her damaged command chamber, staring at reports she did not want to believe. Her ship, one of the most powerful vessels in the entire Dominion fleet, had been humiliated by a species she had dismissed as primitive only weeks earlier. Vaughn, present for the aftermath, chose his words with the same quiet caution he had shown since Geneva. "Commander, I believe it is time we reconsider our approach." For the first time, Icorn did not immediately dismiss him. News of the attack on the Ashen Verdict spread through Dominion communication channels far faster than any previous report from the Sol campaign, and this time, it was impossible to fully censor or contain. A Dominion fleet commander's flagship, forced into retreat by a supposedly primitive species. It was the kind of story that could not simply disappear, no matter how hard Dominion High Command tried to control it. Across the Empire, in supply stations and labor camps and quiet corners of conquered worlds, the whisper that had started weeks earlier grew into something Dominion High Command had never needed to plan for in 6 centuries of unbroken rule. On a mining colony in Halvex space, a small group of workers, emboldened by rumors of Earth's resistance and the retreat of the mighty Ashen Verdict, made a decision that would have been unthinkable only months earlier. They sabotaged a critical piece of mining equipment, not through small, deniable imperfections this time, but through open, deliberate destruction, and then refused to repair it, even under threat of punishment. It was a small act, isolated, quickly and brutally suppressed by Dominion security forces stationed on the colony. But it was the first open act of rebellion the Dominion had seen from a conquered species in over 80 years. It would not be the last. Back on Earth, humanity did not yet know about the quiet cracks spreading through the Empire that had once seemed unbeatable. They knew only that, for the first time since the war began, they had won a real, undeniable victory. Icorn's flagship had retreated. Dominion forces, for the first time, were being forced to reconsider their strategy entirely. It was not enough to win the war. Not yet. Icorn still had dozens of ships, an overwhelming advantage in raw military power, and a growing determination to end this humiliation as quickly and violently as possible. But something fundamental had changed, both on Earth and across the wider Dominion Empire, something that could not be undone with any amount of military force. Fear, the true foundation of 600 years of Dominion power, had finally, for the first time, begun to crack. 3 months after the Krillian Dominion first arrived above Earth, expecting a quick, quiet surrender, Fleet Commander Ressa Icorn stood aboard the repaired Ashen Verdict and made a decision that would define the rest of the war. She requested and received authorization for a full deployment, not a formality fleet, not even the reinforced force she had already brought to Earth, but a true war fleet, the kind the Dominion had not needed to use in generations. 200 warships, orbital bombardment platforms, elite ground legions trained for total planetary conquest rather than simple policing of a defeated population. Dominion High Command approved the request without hesitation. What had once been dismissed as an embarrassing but minor setback had become, in the eyes of the Empire's leadership, something far more dangerous. A symbol. Reports of open rebellion, small but growing, had begun appearing not just among the Halvex, but on 2 other conquered worlds as well. Each incident directly linked, in whispered stories passed quietly between systems, to the ongoing resistance at Sol 3. The Dominion did not fear Earth's weapons. What it feared, for the first time in 6 centuries, was what Earth represented. It could not afford to lose this war, not anymore. Too many eyes across the Empire were watching. On Earth, the Global Defense Coalition understood, through intercepted Dominion communications and the increasingly desperate tone of their broadcasts, that something had shifted. The next attack would not be another formality campaign, another cautious probing assault. It would be everything the Dominion had. Humanity had 3 weeks to prepare before the new fleet arrived, and it used every single hour of that time. Nations that had spent decades distrusting each other now operated as a single, unified defense network, sharing technology, resources, and strategy, with a level of cooperation that would have seemed impossible before the Dominion's ultimatum. The frequency disruption technology that had crippled the Ashen Verdict was refined, miniaturized, and mass-produced. Underground shelters, already built to survive nuclear war, were reinforced further. Every functioning military satellite, repaired rocket, and modified aircraft was prepared for what everyone now understood would be the true, final battle for the future of the planet. Admiral Vaughn, still serving under Icorn despite his growing doubts, made one final attempt to change his commander's approach before the new fleet arrived. "Commander," he said, standing in the same command chamber where he had first reported humanity's refusal, months earlier, "everything we have done here has made them stronger. If we bring overwhelming force and still fail to break them, the damage to the Dominion will be far worse than anything we have already suffered." Icorn's response was cold and final. "Then we will not fail." The Dominion fleet arrived above Earth on a clear morning, blotting out patches of sky with the sheer number of ships descending into formation. It was, by any measure, the largest single military deployment the Dominion had used in over a century. Icorn intended to end the war in a single, overwhelming strike, simultaneous orbital bombardment of every major human population and military center, followed immediately by full ground invasion, crushing any possibility of continued resistance before it could even begin. What she did not know, what her scans and intelligence reports had once again failed to fully capture, was that humanity's true strength had never been in matching the Dominion ship for ship. It had been in becoming impossible to predict. As the Dominion fleet began positioning for its coordinated bombardment, thousands of frequency disruption devices, hidden across the planet in modified civilian satellites, repurposed weather balloons, and small orbital platforms, launched in complete secrecy over the previous 3 weeks, activated simultaneously. It was not a single attack aimed at one flagship this time. It was an attack aimed at the entire fleet at once. A coordinated disruption, unlike anything the Dominion had ever needed to defend against. Shields across dozens of ships flickered and failed in the same critical moment. It was not enough to disable the entire fleet completely, and Icorn's engineers, having studied the earlier attack on the Ashen Verdict, had made some adjustments that limited the damage, but it was enough to throw the Dominion's perfectly coordinated assault into chaos, forcing ships to break formation, redirect power, and scramble to compensate for a weakness they had never had to plan around before. Into that chaos, humanity launched everything it had built in 3 desperate weeks: modified missiles, repurposed rockets, and a small fleet of experimental spaceplanes carrying human pilots willing to fly directly into a battle that, only months earlier, would have seemed like certain suicide. The battle above Earth lasted nearly 6 hours, the longest sustained engagement the Dominion had fought in over 3 centuries. Losses were heavy on both sides. Human casualties were painful and real, ground infrastructure damaged, lives lost that could never be replaced. But Dominion losses, for the first time in the entire war, were catastrophic by their own standards. Nearly a third of Icorn's warfleet was destroyed or disabled, a level of destruction the Dominion had never suffered in a single engagement against any species in 600 years of conquest. Icorn, watching her fleet break apart around her, finally understood what Vaughn had been trying to tell her since the very beginning. This was not a primitive, disorganized species, stumbling into occasional lucky victories. This was a species that had turned every single mistake the Dominion made into a lesson, every defeat into preparation for the next battle. With her fleet crippled and her ground invasion plan now impossible to execute safely, Icorn made the decision no Dominion fleet commander had made in living memory. She ordered a full retreat. The remaining Dominion ships withdrew from Earth's orbit, leaving behind wreckage, damaged vessels too slow to escape, and a silence that, for a brief moment, humanity almost could not believe was real. News of the retreat reached Dominion space far faster than any previous report from the Sol campaign. This time, there was no controlling it, no censoring it into something smaller and less significant. A full Dominion warfleet, sent specifically to crush a single planet's resistance once and for all, had been forced into retreat, its numbers cut by nearly a third in a single battle. The whisper that had started months earlier, in quiet corners of conquered worlds, became something the Dominion could no longer ignore. On the Halvex mining colony, where a small act of sabotage had once been quickly and brutally suppressed, workers rose up in a coordinated uprising, seizing control of critical infrastructure and holding it for nearly 2 full days before Dominion security forces regained control. It was crushed, eventually, but at a cost the Dominion had not expected to pay, and it was not the only uprising. 2 other worlds, inspired by stories of a planet that had refused to kneel and somehow survived, saw their own small acts of resistance grow louder and bolder in the weeks that followed. The Dominion, an empire built on 600 years of unbroken military dominance, and the quiet, unspoken belief among billions of conquered beings that resistance was pointless, found that belief crumbling faster than any single battle could have caused. Fear had always been their true weapon, and fear, once broken, could not simply be repaired with more warships. Back on Earth, the war was not fully over. Smaller skirmishes continued for months, as Dominion remnants regrouped and probed for weaknesses, and the Global Defense Coalition remained on constant alert, unwilling to trust that the empire that had once threatened total conquest would simply walk away. But the Great Invasion, the one meant to end humanity's resistance once and for all, had failed completely. General Elena Cho, standing in the same underground command bunker where she had first watched the Dominion's original ultimatum play across a dozen screens, addressed a room now filled not just with American officers, but with representatives from nearly every major nation on Earth, united in a way the planet had never truly managed before. "They came here expecting a formality," she said. "They leave us a united world, and they've made an enemy that will not stop growing stronger." Far away, in the quiet, uncertain corners of Dominion space, Among species who had spent generations believing resistance was impossible, a new kind of hope had already taken root, one that no fleet, no matter how large, could easily crush again. The Krillian Dominion had built an empire on the belief that no one could stand against them. They had attacked Earth expecting nothing more than another quiet, easy conquest. Instead, without ever fully understanding how or why, they had woken something that 600 years of unbroken victory had never prepared them for. A species that did not know how to stay defeated, and an empire of conquered worlds that, for the first time in living memory, had finally seen proof that the Dominion could bleed. The war for Earth was not truly finished, but the age of the Dominion's absolute, unquestioned power had already, quietly and permanently, come to an end.